Okay, so we should start again. So Johannes Marti is going to tell us about the 4 dimensions of two-dimensionalism.
Yeah, okay, good. So in this talk I will talk about two-dimensionalism, and I will be particularly concerned with making sense of the different interpretations that this framework has received, and I will try to, make sense or to understand the relation that these different interpretations of the framework have towards each other or in between each other. And to this aim, I'm going to define a 4-dimensional modal logic or 4-dimensional semantics, and it will then be the case that the different ways to think about two-dimensional modal logic can be kind of embedded into this 4-dimensional semantics in different ways. So for every of these specific interpretation of the two-dimensional framework, there will be one way to see that interpretation inside of a 4-dimensional framework. And I think that this is helpful, or this clarifies kind of the relation between these different ways to think about two-dimensional modal logic. And the difficult thing there is just that you have two-dimensional modal logic, which is just a formal system, right? It's always the same formal system, but people have thought very differently about it. And I think if you embed them into a 4-dimensional system, then you can see much more clearly what is the different ways of thinking of this two-dimensional semantics, even though that's just one formal system. Okay, so the goal of this talk is basically to explain you this table here. So I will not do that now, but just to give you a rough idea where things are going. And I'm distinguishing here in the different columns, I'm distinguishing different types in which the extension of an expression can depend on the facts in the world. And so these are the columns. And then in the rows, I have different versions of the two-dimensional, or later also 3 and even 4-dimensional semantics. And then the table indicates which of these interpretations takes which kind of context dependence or dependence on facts into which of the dimensions. And then, in the end of the talk, there will be this 4-dimensional system which just distinguishes between all these different ways in which the extension of an expression can depend on whatever facts that might influence it. Okay, and so that's in some sense the main part of the talk, the thing that I want to do first and that I want to get done with it anyway. But then in the end, if I have still some time, I will also talk about the possibility of defining certain modal operators in this 4-dimensional semantics. And this is particularly interesting because, the 4-dimensional system that I use here is very much based, and it's just a straightforward extension of a 3-dimensional modal logic that Gillian Russell has proposed in one of her books. And in that book, she does not explicitly relate her 3-dimensional semantics to these different versions of two-dimensionalism. She just mentions Kaplan, but she doesn't go to she doesn't go into the more extended or more complicated interpretations of the two-dimensional framework. And basically, I'm taking her system and just kind of using it for a different purpose than she has devised it for. And what was actually her purpose, so this is what I want to say, what actually was her purpose to give this 3-dimensional modal logic is to give a modal definition of the notion of analyticity. So her book is about analyticity, and in the first part she uses a 3-dimensional semantics in order to say, now we can define a sentence as analytic if it has this and these properties inside of the 3-dimensional semantics. And now, because I'm just using her kind of system and it extended a little bit, but that means I can also use her notion of analyticity. And that will be interesting because it will be possible to compare it to the notion of a priority, which has been proposed by certain people working with one particular variant of the two-dimensional framework. And if I do this, or if one does this, then it actually turns out that certain claims which Russell makes about her modal definition of analyticity don't really work, or if they work, they would also be counter-arguments against an epistemic notion or the epistemic notion of a priority. So Russell gives arguments against her modal definition of analyticity in the book. So she defines this notion, and then she argues against it, and later in the book gives a completely different account. And these arguments, they seem not to be that strong if you actually see them in the context of these different versions of two-dimensionalism, and you compare them, or you use in these arguments the epistemic notion of a priority instead of just an intuitive notion that Russell uses. So that's something that I might do then in the second part, that I will talk about a little bit about analyticity as Gillian Russell does it, and compare it to the notion of a priority that has been used in one of the frameworks. But now first, I want to explain, well, what is two-dimensional modal logic, just very quickly, just to get kind of the definitions going and my terminology. And then I will talk about these different interpretations of the framework, which I'm trying to kind of all capture all at once in this system. So that's probably that's the first part of the talk, and probably also the most important one. So I start with just two-dimensional modal logic just as a formal system. And the idea there is that it's basically just a straightforward extension of one-dimensional modal logic. And now, instead of relativizing the truth value of sentences to just one possible world, we use two possible worlds. And that's it. So where in one-dimensional modal logic, a model would be, in a simple case of a model for one-dimensional modal logic would be just a valuation function, which tells us for every atomic sentence the set of worlds where that sentence is true. Now this is a bit more complicated. Now we have for every atomic sentence just the set of pairs of worlds relative to which that sentence is considered to be true. And that's in some sense just a technical setup. And then if we have such a valuation function, we can say that one of these atomic sentences is true relative to two of those worlds if the pair of these two worlds is in that set of pairs of worlds associated to that sentence. Okay, that's the formal system. And now there is some part which is kind of common to all the interpretations of the systems, and that is that it always makes sense to think of the first world in this pair as some kind of context, but then it depends on the actual interpretation, what this means in detail. And the second world in these pairs, it's always kind of a world of evaluation. And the purpose of this world of evaluations, and this is also something which is common to all the different frameworks which I discuss later, is that it is that possible world which is shifted by ordinary modal operators. And that means that if you're going to, or one example, or maybe the most important example, which I will also use, is the necessity operator here, which in ordinary modal logic just quantifies over all possible worlds. And now it basically does the same thing, but it just quantifies over all possible worlds, but only in the second component, only in the world of evaluations. And the context stays constant, it doesn't change when you use a necessity operator. But this is something that would work not only for necessity, but also, well, probably for temporal operators and for counterfactuals as well. So for all kinds of modalities that have a straightforward one-dimensional semantics, they would just act on the world of evaluations and keep the context fixed. It might be that for so this is an exception for epistemic operators, the thing might be a bit more complicated, and well, I'm not talking about them that much. So, well, I just want to mention this, that maybe for epistemic operators it's not that straightforward, that they would not embed in that straightforward way into the two-dimensional setting. But for more metaphysical operators, this is how it works. And now the difference between the different versions to think about this two-dimensional semantics is kind of a difference in what you take, or what is the purpose of this context world, of this first component in these pairs. And the first interpretation, which, well, the one that everyone is kind of basing, that is kind of the basis for all later interpretations, is the one by Kaplan, which is to use this two-dimensional framework as in semantics, a formal semantics for indexical expressions. And here, coming from Amsterdam, so they told me I should also mention that actually this is, philosophers now always associate this very much to Kaplan because he has worked out very much in detail. But this idea of using a two-dimensional semantics for indexicality actually goes back to Hans Kamp, who has a paper, well, on the indexical now and how it embeds into a temporal logic. So I want to mention that, but from now on I will just talk about as if it was just Kaplan's system and Kaplan semantics. Okay, and I think that you're probably very familiar with it, so I will not motivate really why we use this two-dimensional framework. I will just kind of quickly go through this example to make a bit clear how things work. So the first thing is that we need to do if we want to give a semantics for indexicals is that we somehow have to provide this information that indexicals need, right, that we refer to. And this is some more contextual information. And that means that basically we cannot just use possible worlds, because a possible world is not enough to fix, for instance, a speaker or time of utterance or things like that. So we need a bit more structure. And the solution that I want to use here, and it's kind of a trick. I will just assume that I'm always working with centered possible worlds, and then whatever information I use or is needed for to fix a referent of indexicals is provided somehow by this centering of the world. I don't want to go too much into detail what is actually involved in this centering of worlds. And I will also call them now just possible worlds, even though I think of them as centered possible worlds, and just use the letters W to denote them. So that's that's actually the first observation by Kaplan, but that's somehow not enough. What you additionally need is some kind of this two-dimensional mechanism. And well, I have this simple example here on the slide, and I just want to go through this one to explain what is going on. Okay, no. First, let me say, so the idea is that the context worlds now is just there in order to provide the referent of indexicals. And so if you have an indexical in a sentence and you want to find what is the referent of this indexical, you go to the context world and look what is the referent at the center of the context world, and you don't do it at the world of evaluation. And so this, in particular, this means if you move into counterfactual worlds by using a necessity modality, that indexicals will still refer back to the reference they would have in the actual world, even though you're evaluating the sentence at a counterfactual world. And this is in some sense the crucial trick for which you need this two-dimensional setting, and which makes this semantics going. And I have a simple example now for this. So we have, that would be the sentence, I'm in Donostia. We have just two possible worlds here. The first one is centered on one individual, A, which is in Donostia. And we have another individual there, B, which is also in Donostia. And then we have another possible world which is centered on the other individual B, who is in Donostia there, but in that world A is in Amsterdam. And then if you would look at the sentence I am Donostia, it would have the following two-dimensional intention associated to it. So if you look at this sentence and it's uttered in the context W0, so it's uttered by A, then that sentence, what A says in that sentence is true in the world W0, because there it's actually the case that A is in Donostia, but it is false in the context W0 relative to the world W1, because there A is in Amsterdam. Even though at world W1, the person at the center of the world W1 is also in Donostia. But that doesn't really matter, and that is in some sense the intuition that Kaplan had, that we always have to take the actual speaker of the actual context and use that one as the referent. And then there's a similar thing for the world, for W1. So if the sentence is uttered in W1 by B, then this is a sentence which is true relative to both of these worlds, because in both of the worlds B is in Donostia. And well, the complicated way to represent this is to use this set of pairs, but you can also just use these matrices. And the idea in these matrices here is that the rows, they are the different contexts in which the sentence gets uttered, and then what is said in this sentence can be true relative to different worlds of evaluations, which are the columns of such a table. Okay, so this is Kaplan's two-dimensional semantics, and so the basic idea there is that the context just fixes the reference of indexicals, and that is really all that it does. And yeah. And then I will come to one first kind of extension of this, which is now a different interpretation of this framework, which is what I call now the epistemic interpretation of two-dimensionalism. It is sometimes also called the generalized interpretation of two-dimensionalism. And well, this one is mainly associated to Frank Jackson and David Chalmers, but also their ideas have been around earlier. So there is some early paper by Stolnaker where he in some sense already proposes some of these things, even though he later comes to say that what he meant was something completely different. And there's also this paper by Davis and Humberstone where they have actually similar ideas, even though they phrase them still very differently, and it's not as developed. Okay, and I think in what I say here, I will mainly follow the way how Chalmers actually explains this interpretation. So in doubt, I'm sticking, I guess, to Chalmers. And well, basically, the idea there is to treat just a much wider class than just indexicals, a much wider class of expressions than just indexicals as context dependent. And in some sense, they get handled a little bit like indexicals. And but basically, it is not so clear what is this wider class of expressions and which expressions actually would turn out to be context dependent. But what I'm saying now here is that it should be all twin-earthable expressions. That is also not very precise which are the twin-earthable expressions. But the reason is somehow that the idea behind this interpretation is to make sense of kind of twin-earth cases, and what comes with these twin-earth cases are these sentences which are necessary truth, but they are still a posteriori necessary truth. And the ambition of this interpretation of the framework is kind of to use the two-dimensional modal logic to explain what is going on when we have a necessary a posteriori truth. As an example, I have here the sentence, water is H2O, and that's, as you I guess know, it's like a necessary truth, so it's considered to be necessarily true. But there's still a sense in which that sentence could have been false, and then people would say it's not a priori, but it's only a posteriori true. And for this sentence, there are two worlds which are interesting to consider. So one world would be just the actual world, and there it is the case that kind of the water is H2O, the substance around us is H2O. And then we have another possible world, W1, which would be twin Earth, where kind of the role that water has in our world is taken over by a different substance, XYZ. Now, it's not, or for what I say here, it's not really important whether we think of W1 actually as a different possible world, or whether we think of it as the actual world centered on a different planet. I think both of them would actually work in this example. Okay, and if we do this, then the idea is that now in this sentence, water is H2O, the term water is in some sense functioning like an indexical. So relative to different contexts, it picks out different substances as the referent as water. And in our world, it would actually turn out to pick out H2O. So that sentence, water is H2O, relative to the context of our world, expresses a necessarily true proposition, because it basically just becomes that H2O is H2O, and that's true no matter where we are. But at twin Earth, this expression water would pick out a different substance, which is XYZ. And then at twin Earth, when it picks out this substance, the sentence would in some sense say that XYZ is H2O, which would be necessarily false. And now, it is maybe, so this talk about picking out a referent in a different world, this is in some sense somewhat problematic, and it's not that clear how to make that precise, what is really meant by picking out a referent, what is even the referent of such a term, or also how do you go about in finding out in very strange counterfactual worlds what the reference of a term there would be. But this is in some sense, this is just a difficulty that you have for this interpretation. But in some sense, the crucial thing that so no matter how you make this precise in detail, the crucial thing that people want to get at is that you should do it in such a way that then it turns out that whenever a sentence is actually true everywhere on the diagonal of such a matrix, it should be a priori. And in some sense, I have now the definition of a priority that these people have been using here. So you would call a sentence a priori if it's true at every world at that diagonal entry of that world. And then often the explanations that come from how do you have to think about these worlds, or how do you actually fix the reference, these explanations are always kind of pushed into or put into such a way that actually this definition works. So this is in some sense the crucial claim behind this interpretation of the framework. And if you think now back at the example, right, so the sentence water is H2O, it would be necessarily true, but it would be not a priori. I mean, the reason would be that it's false if we take the context of twin Earth and then evaluate at twin Earth. Okay. So this is the epistemic interpretation, and the important thing there, or kind of the role of the context in this interpretation, is to provide reference to really a wide class of expressions, which are not just called the twin-earthable expressions. And now I can already say, where we are standing, right? We had Kaplan's two-dimensional system. So there the first dimension was just the one which is shifted by necessity or by ordinary modal operators. And the second dimension is the one which fixes the referent of indexicals. So we can represent this here in the first row of this table. And then in the epistemic interpretation, we again have that the first dimension is the one shifted by necessity operators. But now the second dimension, it has kind of these two roles. First, it fixes also the reference of indexicals, but then it also fixes the reference of all kinds of other expressions, and these are all the expressions that you need to get kind of that framework working. And now later, so if you now look at this kind of proposes that maybe you could just look already at a three-dimensional system in which you would distinguish between these two different roles that the context might play. So one of the roles is just to fix the reference of indexicals, and then there is this additional thing that it kind of does that is fixing the referent for twin-earthable expressions. And this is basically what Gillian Russell has proposed in her three-dimensional system. So she proposes a system which looks like this. She has three dimensions. The first one is, again, just the one shifted by the modal operators. The second one is just there to provide reference to indexicals. And then the third dimension should kind of do all this kind of things that is left over, that the epistemic context does, that Kaplan doesn't do. So it provides, to say it in an easy way, it provides the reference to these twin-earthable expressions. Well, it's not entirely clear whether this is really what Russell has in mind in her book, because she does not refer very explicitly to the epistemic interpretation of the two-dimensional framework. So her system, or when she explains her system, she only refers back to Kaplan, and she explicitly says that she intends the first two dimensions of her framework to be just like the two dimensions in Kaplan's system. But she does not really say that her third dimension should capture then everything else that you would have in the epistemic interpretation. But there's one remark that she does make about the epistemic interpretation. So she explicitly mentions Jackson and Chalmers, and she says that Jackson and Chalmers wrongly thought that you could treat these cases of reference fixing that you have in twin earth examples as a case of context dependence in the Kaplanian sense, and that she is now correcting this by providing a different context, a different world. So I think from this, this kind of suggests that you might take the third context to do exactly that work, which is left over in some sense from Kaplan's second dimensions relative to the epistemic second dimension. But this might be, she doesn't really make that claim explicitly. I will, however, assume that from now on in the talk. Okay, so then there's one additional thing one additional kind of dependence of the extension that I want to talk about, and the motivation to have this as well is kind of the metasemantic interpretation of two-dimensionalism. And this is a reading of the framework or a way of thinking of the framework that is now mainly associated to Stolnaker. But also here, there are some very early papers by Bas van Fraassen where he uses a two-dimensional modal logic. And it seems to me that in the way that he talks about it and kind of also the modality that he defines for it, he seems to have really something like this in mind. He doesn't call it like this because this is a terminology by Stolnaker. But it seems to me that actually Van Fraassen was already, when Stolnaker was still kind of confused between the epistemic and the metasemantic interpretation, Van Fraassen was actually already using this one here, it seems to me at least. And in that interpretation, basically, what the context does, it provides all the facts that you need in order to determine the one-dimensional intension which is associated to a sentence. And these are, as before, these are facts which are kind of reference-fixing things, but these are especially also all other facts like linguistic conventions, for example, or whatever you have that makes it the case that a certain expression has a certain meaning. And I think it's most intuitive, and for what I'm saying here, it's probably sufficient to think of these facts mainly as being linguistic conventions. So in different contexts, you might have different linguistic conventions, and just because of these expressions that are used in this context turn out to express different propositions or to have different contents. And to explain this on an example, I have this example here, which is kind of an adaptation of or an extension of an example that Stolnaker gives. And here we have a simple sentence, 7 plus 5 is 12. And we use 3 different centered worlds. The first one is just a usual context like this one here. The second world, W1, is a world which is centered on it might still be in the actual world, but it's a different context where you have some computer scientists who actually use a hexadecimal notation to write down numbers, which is actually convenient in computer science because it corresponds better to the bits or bytes that they have in their computers. And W2 is then really a counterfactual world. It would be a very different world where the planet Earth has a green atmosphere, and the community living there, at least at the center of that world, would be a community which uses a script which looks very much like our mathematical notation. And it turns out that 7 plus 5 is 12 in that script just means that the sky is blue. And now if you look at this sentence, right, in our actual context, this is just a mathematical claim, and this claim is necessarily true, so it's true relative to all possible worlds. Now, if you look at this sentence in the context with these computer scientists, then what this claim actually, or what this sentence actually expresses is not that 7 plus 5 is 12, but it expresses that 7 plus 5 is it's 18. Because in hexadecimal notation, the number 1, 2 would be the way how you write the number 18. So that sentence would then be, as a mathematical claim, that's just false, and therefore it's necessarily false, and it's false in all possible worlds. And then in this last context, which I kind of imagined or made up here, well, by construction there, the sentence would basically mean that the sky is blue, so that would be true in our world, it would be true in this, well, different context in our world, but it would be false in their counterfactual context because they would live on a planet where the atmosphere is actually, or where the sky is actually green. Okay, so one thing which is, I think, also important about this example is if you would look at the two-dimensional matrix that you associate to this sentence with Kaplan's framework or with the epistemic framework, then you would get a different matrix. Also, with the epistemic framework, this sentence would be just necessarily true, and it would be necessarily true in all the contexts, so all the entries would be just true, because the sentence does not contain anything like twin-earthable expressions. These are in some sense super rigid terms which occur in this sentence. They refer to mathematical objects, and this doesn't change according to the possible worlds in which you are. And this is in some sense also relevant because the sentence 7 plus 5 is 12 should be a priori true. And it would, of course, turn out to be a priori true with the epistemic definition if you have true everywhere in the matrix. But if you would use now the metasemantic interpretation, so you use this matrix here, then the sentence is not a priori true, because, I mean, then we have contexts in which that sentence would be false. So, for instance, for the computer scientists, that would be false, or also in this counterfactual world, that sentence would turn out to be false. So what is good about this example here is that it really illustrates the distinction between the epistemic and the metasemantic interpretation. There's one more thing that I want to say here. So you could also give the example from the slide before, the one with, two slides before, the one water is H2O. And if you would capture that with the metasemantic interpretation, you would actually get exactly the same matrix as you had already in the epistemic interpretation. However, the explanation that you would give why this is the right matrix to associate to the sentence might be, in some sense, it would be an easier explanation. You would just say that at twin Earth, the sentence water is H2O would have had a different meaning, and you wouldn't have to make a complicated story about how the reference gets fixed depending on the context. Okay. So to summarize this quickly, so the role that a context plays here is just to capture all the facts, and these are mainly probably linguistic conventions, which influence that in a certain context a sentence expresses a certain one-dimensional intention. And then, well, if you draw this in this table, then the second dimension, right, the role of the context is just to take care of all these factors. So it provides the linguistic facts, and in some sense it fixes the twin-earthable expressions, or the referent of twin-earthable expressions, even though you don't really have to explain how this works, because you can just take this to be part of the meaning. And it also fixes the indexicals. Now there's one thing so Stollmaker kind of, when he presents this system, what he says, or what he would like to say, is that on the metasemantic interpretation, the context captures the dependence of meanings on the facts which hold in a context. But he does it in some paper where he actually explains this interpretation, and then he noticed that this is a bit strange because that will kind of force us to take meanings to be just one-dimensional intentions, just contents, or what is said. And that's a very narrow notion of meaning, which is in some sense strange, because you would have that indexicals, for instance, change their meaning according to the context, right? In different contexts, the indexical would refer to different things, and if you would use just the first dimension, you would just call the variance over the first dimension meaning, then indexical would change their meaning in every context. And that's something which is a bit strange, because you would rather intuitively say that indexicals have the same meaning relative to every context. It's just that meaning is in some sense especially context dependent. And when he makes this remark, he says, yeah, well, we could also look actually at a three-dimensional system in which we have Kaplanian meanings, so characters as meanings, and then we have an additional third dimension which captures the dependence of these characters on whatever other facts you might have, which probably are linguistic conventions. So the system that he suggests, and this is really just in parentheses in his papers, is kind of the system which would look like this, right? So you have the first two dimensions, they are just like Kaplan's characters, and then you have one third dimension which takes care of the rest. Okay. And I think from this it's now already, well, it's straightforward what the four-dimensional system will be or would be, right? Then you would just distinguish between all of these four different types. So basically it's just Russell's three-dimensional system with one extra dimension added, which takes care of of these linguistic conventions, probably. Or a different way to think about it, it could be just Stolnaker's three-dimensional system, but now you additionally distinguish between the parts of meaning which are kind of in these twin-earthable expressions and the part of meaning which is kind of more general, which is based on probably conventions. Now here I want to also make one other remark. So it is actually often a bit confusing what you call meanings in this framework. And I was now already mentioned this, that it is a bit strange to call kind of just variance in the first dimensions and expressions meaning. So often people call this the content, or Kaplan also calls this what is said by a sentence. And then people like Kaplan would call the first two dimensions, or just the characters, what he calls characters, this would be in some sense the meaning that you associate to a sentence. And it seems to me that also Stolnaker would call the variance of these first two dimensions what is the meaning of a sentence. And even Gillian Russell says that. So she says that the first two dimensions, they capture meaning, and the third dimension, that's something different, that is something metasemantic. This is a bit strange for Gillian Russell, actually, because she says that, I should explain that maybe later. So she says truth in virtue of meaning then will be not meaning in that sense, but it will be an even wider notion. But she noticed that in her paper. But okay, I can maybe explain that later when I talk about her definition. Now, what is, however, the case that these epistemic people like Chalmers and Jackson, they would say that the meaning of an expression can actually kind of have all these first three dimensions, all these variants. So they would say that at least in one sense of the meaning of an expression, the meaning, for instance, of water is not just constant. It would still depend in some sense on the context. And that's a claim which is kind of very disputable, and people have kind of said, this doesn't really make sense. And this also, the criticism on the framework is often kind of phrased in that way, that they have the wrong conception of meaning. Now, what at least Chalmers says to this, or replies to this kind of objections, is that, well, basically it doesn't really matter what we call meanings, right? The interesting thing is that we can just set up the framework in this way. So I think that the interesting point here is not really what we call now the meaning, but the interesting point is whether we can really make this distinction between the third and the fourth dimension, which is crucial for the epistemic interpretation. Whether we can really single out what is the kind of context dependence that you have in twin-earthable expressions that is different from the very wide kind of context dependence that, well, every sentence is in some sense dependent on the facts about conventions or like meaning in a wide sense that you might have at the world. And it is basically that you can make this distinction in a meaningful, or in a fruitful way, which is criticized, I think, by Stolnakers and people like this. So the crucial question is not really what do we call meaning, but the crucial question is whether it actually makes sense to distinguish between the third and the fourth dimension. And for my talk, I will have to, I do make this distinction, and that's basically just because I want to be able to embed the epistemic interpretation. So I have to make at least the kind of assumptions that they are making. Otherwise, I could not have a framework which is able to capture the epistemic interpretation. But I don't want to make a stance. I don't want to have a stance on whether this distinction between the third and the fourth dimension is actually, well, how to make it and whether you can actually make it in a fruitful way. Okay. So this gives you an idea about the four-dimensional system. And I have one slide in which I quickly give the formal definition because I might use that then later in the talk. Just in the example that I give afterwards. So the idea here is basically like in two-dimensional semantics, but now instead of 2 dimensions, you have 4 dimensions. And so you have these quadruples of worlds. And now I'm using the following terminology. So the last world is still the world of evaluation. And it will have the purpose that it's the one which is shifted by the one-dimensional modalities. This is as it was in all the interpretations before as well. And then we have 3 context dimensions. The first one of those is the context of utterance. And this is actually Russell's terminology, so she uses this terminology. And this is the context which fixes just the reference for indexicals. And then we have the third dimensions, which is the context of introduction. This is also Russell's terminology, and this one kind of provides the reference to these twin-earthable expressions. And then lastly, we have something like the linguistic context, which takes care of all the other things that are left over by the other context, which basically does the thing that Stolnaker wants the context to do, minus the things that are now already done by the context of introduction and the context of utterance. So probably it would just provide kind of the conventions which which determine the meaning of expressions. Okay, and now, we have kind of this relation, right? So we have this four-dimensional modal logic, and we can now see how the different two-dimensional systems embed into this four-dimensional system. So for instance, Kaplan's system, this is just taking the first two dimension out of the four-dimensional system. Or the epistemic interpretation, it takes the first dimension out, and then it collapses the second and the third dimension. And the way to make this precise is on the following slide. I want to go through this just very quickly. So we could now take a four-dimensional model that is evaluation, which assigns to sentences quadruples of worlds. And now inside of this model, we can kind of find different two-dimensional models, and where they are inside of this four-dimensional model depends on what kind of interpretation of the two-dimensional framework we are using. So if you have a four-dimensional model and you fix an actual world in that four-dimensional world, four-dimensional model, an actual world W, then you could talk about the character, the Kaplanian character that expressions have at this actual world inside of the four-dimensional model by just putting the actual world into the first two contexts, so in the linguistic context and in the context of introduction, and then using the two-dimensional model to kind of capture the variance that you had in the context of utterance and with the world of evaluation. So in this way, for every possible world, you find in a four-dimensional model just characters that expressions have at that possible world. And a similar thing you can do for the epistemic interpretation. So we saw this here, right? The epistemic interpretation, it has the world of evaluations in the same way as the four-dimensional setting, but then the context just takes the second and the third dimension together. And how you could make that precise is that, well, if you fix an actual world, then the right epistemic two-dimensional intention to associate two expressions at this actual world is given by the definition here in the middle. So you use the actual world as the linguistic context, but then you use the context which is already which is already kind of a variable in this epistemic, or which changes in this two-dimensional setting, and to use that the epistemic context for the context of introduction and for the context of utterance. And then the world of evaluation is again the same. And a similar thing you can do for the metasemantic interpretation, so there you get then also, you can just collapse kind of all the context dimensions into one. And now, the point which I'm kind of making here is that if you now have a four-dimensional model which correctly captures the properties of expressions, then if you use this kind of embeddings to get a two-dimensional model, so whenever you have a four-dimensional model which correctly captures the property of expressions, then for instance the character which you would define in this way, as in the first line, would also correctly capture the characters of expressions at the world W. Or similarly, if you have a four-dimensional model which kind of does the right thing, and you fix the world W0, then the correct epistemic interpretation or epistemic two-dimensional model to associate to expressions at the world W0 is given by the thing here in the middle. And okay, so I think what this should show is that you can embed these different kinds of two-dimensionalism into one four-dimensional framework. And I think what this kind of suggests, so if this really works, and if especially this here works, that this in some sense is that this preserves kind of the meaning of what is going on, then what this shows is that in some sense these different interpretations of the two-dimensional frameworks are just, they single out different kinds of context dependence, but they are not in some sense competing interpretation of one single framework. They just happen to use the same formal system, but they use it to look at different aspects of context dependence. So you might actually think of them as being like rather coexisting, of just looking at different things rather than being competing interpretation of one single thing. Okay. Now I have only a very little bit of time, I guess. Okay. Wow. Good. In that case, I will. So this is now the first part of my talk. So I will now talk about these things that I said that I might talk a little bit about later, and this is about how you can define modalities in this four-dimensional system. And the motivation here is now especially to look also at Russell's definition of analyticity and see how it fares in this setting. So the first thing is necessity, right? Necessity is just the same thing as usual. It just quantifies over the world of evaluation, and it keeps all the other worlds, all the context worlds constant. So this is basically the right thing to do. And then we have another notion that is a priority, and I had this already on the slide for the epistemic interpretation. I have this now here again, how it is done in epistemic two-dimensionalism. And if you now think how would you embed this, or how would you transport this into the four-dimensional setting, then you would get the clause which I have here as the third line on this slide. And well, maybe you just see why this is the right way to do it. But the idea behind this definition is now that if whenever you have a four-dimensional model and you fix an actual world, you can find at this actual world a two-dimensional model. And now it should be the case that if in the two-dimensional model a sentence which contains the analyticity operator is true according to the epistemicist's definition of a priority, then that sentence should also be true relative to kind of these indexes at the four-dimensional model. So if you use this definition in the four-dimensional system, then actually it turns out that it works well with the way how you think of the two-dimensional models as being embedded into the four-dimensional one. Okay. And well, this is for a priority, and basically the clause which I give here is really, this is forced on me to use this clause by the way how it's defined in the epistemic setting, and by the way how I embed the epistemic setting into the four-dimensional one. And then we have the notion of analyticity. And what Russell's definition is still in a three-dimensional system where we just have a context of utterance and a context of introduction, but we don't have the fourth dimension. We don't have the context of the linguistic context. And the definition that she gives is the following: so a sentence is analytic relative to some kind of context and some possible world. If for every pair of possible worlds, if you use the first world as the context of introduction, and the second world as context of utterance and context of evaluation, it always turns out that the sentence is true. So you vary over all these contexts other than the linguistic context, and then this variance is such that you vary the context of introduction independent of the other two dimensions. And this is just the definition that she gives, and she gives some arguments, some examples why this, at least intuitively, makes a lot of sense to use this definition. And now the way how I embed this into the four-dimensional system is as follows. This is now the next slide. So if you now look at the definition or the next line, so if you look at this definition there, then the last three dimensions, which are the ones which are already in Russell's system, is just exactly the same as what Russell is doing. But then there's one special thing which I do, right? You have a linguistic context, and I let the analyticity modality change the linguistic context to the actual world. This might seem a bit strange, but I have an example right on the next slide then which justifies this, actually. But don't worry about this for now. So the important thing is now also here just that in the last three dimensions, it's basically the same thing as what Russell does in her system. And now, if we use this definition of analyticity, we can compare it with epistemic notion of a priority. And we can see that, well, apart from this special thing that it does to the linguistic context, it almost does the same thing. It quantifies universally over the last three dimensions. However, there's a difference, and that is that analyticity has this independence in the quantification, whereas for a priority, we would have the same world in all of these dimensions. So this is kind of the difference between the two notions, but one thing which we have in particular is that if you compare the two notions, then it will be always the case if a sentence is analytic according to Russell's definition, then it's also a priori. Because the quantification for analyticity has actually in some sense more independence than the one for a priority, which is more constrained. And this is expressed here on the last line where it becomes kind of a generalized diagonal validity of the four-dimensional modal logic that analyticity implies a priority. And this is an interesting result because one of the arguments that Gillian Russell gives against her notion of her modal definition of analyticity is precisely that she claims that if you would use her notion of analyticity, the modal notion of analyticity, then there are sentences which would turn out to be analytic true, but which are not a priori true. And she thinks it's a desiderata for a notion of analyticity that analytic sentence should also turn out to express a priori truth. So she says that this is a counter-argument against her notion of analyticity. However, now, because of this here, if you use the epistemic notion of a priority, then this just can't happen because it is just like a basic result about the logic that analyticity implies a priority. So what Russell has in mind in her paper seems to be rather an intuitive notion of a priority and not the one which epistemic two-dimensionalists have already been using in their framework. And I think this is kind of an interesting result because it shows that either this argument by Russell against her own notion of analyticity fails, or if it goes through, then it would also be a counter-argument against the epistemic notion of a priority. Okay, now I have one last slide in which I justify that we change the linguistic context in the definition of analyticity. So I told you on the slide before I'm doing this strange thing there, but I didn't say why I'm doing it. And I have this slide which should explain why this is the right thing to do. So, right, we have this definition here of analyticity. So the top one is the one that I had on the slide before. And the last three dimensions now, that's just what Russell does, so we do the same thing. But then the linguistic context, we don't use the linguistic context that we're kind of coming from when we evaluate such the analyticity operator, but we use the linguistic context which was the world of evaluation at that point. And you might wonder why we're doing it in that way and not as it is done in the second line. Why don't we just keep the linguistic context constant and then do all these quantifications over the other contexts? And the reason for this is, well, the abstract reason for this is I think that analyticity is often thought of, or usually thought of, as being a sentential operator. And I think it might be kind of a special thing for sentential operators that they actually depend on a change in linguistic context. And to kind of justify this, I have the following example. So this is a counterfactual, which I think should turn out to be true. And it is as follows. So if bachelors were called zebra, then the sentence, all zebra are unmarried men, would be analytic. So I think that this should turn out to be a true counterfactual. And the idea there is that, well, if bachelors were called zebras, then meanings would be different. So that sentence would mean something different, and it would actually mean something which is, in that case, analytic true, at least if all things are most likely as they are in the actual world. So do I have still some time to? Okay, now then I just give you this, and I kind of presuppose that you have an idea how to evaluate the counterfactual. So if we move into these counterfactual worlds, what we do, because the counterfactual is just an ordinary modality, it just changes the world of evaluations, but it doesn't change the linguistic context. So if you move into these counterfactual worlds where bachelors are called zebra, then the world of evaluation will be a different world where actually the meanings are different, such that, well, bachelors are called zebra, but the linguistic context will be still the one that we had in the actual world. So if we then want this to be analytic, we however need if we want the sentence, all zebras are unmarried men, to be analytic, we however need the meanings of these counterfactual worlds. So we need the meanings that we had in the world of evaluations, and not the meanings which you have in the linguistic context, which was just the actual world, because otherwise that sentence would just still not be analytic, even in those counterfactual worlds, if you would take the meanings that we actually have in the actual world. And, well, to illustrate this point a bit more, so you can compare this to this other counterfactual, which I think should be false. It's, if bachelors were called zebra, then it would be a priori that all zebra are unmarried men. So I think at least I have the impression what you would say there is, well, if bachelor was called zebras, then that would be, well, there would be a difference in these other worlds, but then it would still not be a priori there that actual zebras are unmarried men, because we are still using our language to evaluate the embedded sentence in the consequent of this counterfactual. And this turns out false exactly because analyticity didn't have this thing that it changed the linguistic context. Analyticity kept the linguistic context constant. Okay, so, then I have another example, but this one I don't want to talk about, it's very technical. So basically now I come into the conclusion. So I had two parts in the talk. The first one was that you can define a four-dimensional modal logic, and this kind of helps you to compare the different versions of two-dimensional semantics. And there's maybe one last remark that I want to make about this. So I don't want to say now you should always use like four-dimensional modal logic and this is the right thing to work with, because it's actually just rather complicated and annoying to work with. But I think it's just a helpful thing to have it kind of in the background, to think about if you use one kind of two-dimensional system, to just see how it relates to the other ones. And then if you're in doubt how certain things work, you can maybe think about the four-dimensional system. However, if you don't need certain of the distinctions, or you don't need certain kinds of context dependence, then you can better just forget about them, or you can collapse them. Okay, and then the second thing is that I was using this Russell's notion of analyticity that you would have in this four-dimensional system, and I compared it to the epistemic notion of a priority, and it actually turns out that they fit together very well, which is actually contrary to what Russell has claimed herself in her book. Okay, but Russell has made a claim about an intuitive notion of a priority and not about the epistemic one, so this probably explains the difference. Okay, that's it.
Am I allowed to close this? Yes? No? Oh, yes. Okay. Where are you? I very much enjoyed the paper. I just want to comment on sort of one issue that has to do with the key proposal, the sort of four-dimensional semantics. I'm not going to talk about analyticity. I mean, mostly because I don't know enough about Russell's work to really be able to comment on the discussion between you and her. So what I wanted to do was to sort of look at your four-dimensional, I can't go. So your four-dimensional semantics, focusing a bit more than you do in the paper, and I have to acknowledge that you've done more to address that in the talk than you did in the paper, by focusing on the notion of meaning, actually. I'm sorry. Because, I mean, so, you very much speak in terms of, having these different word parameters that might sort of, or these different dimensions that might sort of do different things, or different type of context that might do different things. But I wanted to sort of look at the issue from the perspective of the notions of meaning you get, and sort of assess your claim, if you wish, that these dimensions, don't, capture things that are not sort of competing notions of context dependence, but sort of things that are can live alongside one another. Okay, so just to sort of set things up, so I want to say, sorry, I find it very hard to speak while standing still. It's just, yeah, I'm going to hold it. No, it's okay. I should be able to handle that for 10 minutes. So I just want to start with the sort of the Kaplan and stuff, and talk briefly about the two extensions. You talk about the epistemic extension and then the metasemantic extension. But like more from the perspective of the notion of character, or what happens to the notion of character or meaning in this extension. So you're all very familiar with the sort of standard application of the two-dimensional semantics. Is the case of indexicals, that's the Kaplanian semantics. And so you have these sort of two parameters, or word parameters, or the way you put it, the second and first, or the first and second dimension. So you have the context of utterance, and you have the word of the context of utterance, and you have the word of the circumstance of evaluation. And the way it works in sort of the Kaplanian framework is that the character of an indexical together with the context of utterance determines its content, and then you have the content of a sentence containing an indexical together with the circumstance of evaluation of that sentence, which determines its truth values. That's sort of the double dependence you were talking about. And so, for Kaplan, indexicals have a character, and that takes you to a content or a referent for the relevant indexical in a given context. And so then, there are these sort of two extensions of the Kaplanian framework you talk about. So first, two expressions that are not, or at least not obviously indexicals, such as, natural kind terms, proper names, and, things, expressions that in your way of thinking about it like are twin earthable. And then, those extensions typically also come with a reinterpretation of the notion of character, right? The notion of character is going to work differently than it does in the Kaplanian framework. So just to sort of, use the sort of example you use in the paper, just take water as H2O. So on the sort of epistemic extent, what you call the Chalmers extension, the epistemic extension, you have, this sort of double dependence. So you have the first and the second dimension, but that also means that the notion of meaning or character is reinterpreted in that two-dimensional framework, right? So the way you put it in the paper is the character of water is its reference fixing description or the a priori connections associated to it. That's the way Chalmers put it. So for instance, you could imagine that, the character of water is going to be like the watery stuff, or the example you use, I think, in the paper is the liquid that fills fountains. So you'll have some sort of description associated with water, and that together with a given context, so the Earth context or the twin Earth context, will give you different contents, right? So that's, one sort of new interpretation or interpretation of the notion of character or the notion of meaning that you had in the Kaplanian standard two-dimensional framework. And some people have associated that idea of character with that notion, the notion of narrow content or internal content or something like that. And then you contrasted that with the sort of metasemantic extension of the Kaplanian framework offered by Stanaker, where, insofar as you could think in terms of, the character for an expression such as water, that would be interpreted metasemantically, so it would consist of the facts that together with other features of the context determine the referent of water. So for instance, it might also consist of the external physical facts such as being on Earth rather than twin Earth. The environment with which the speakers causally interact. So maybe in the case of Stanaker, it doesn't really make sense to talk of character. It's just going to be a constant function, but there will be this sort of idea that this context. Sorry. I have 4 minutes? All right, okay. So on this Stanaker interpretation, then, insofar as you can talk of a notion of character, it's going to be this sort of metasemantic or this constant function. Okay, so what you want to do with the four-dimensional semantics is have a semantics, if I understood well, that embeds or encompasses all these various understanding of what a two-dimensional semantics might be or might do, and the way you do that, I've just listed the sort of four dimensions on the handout, and the way you speak about these sort of different dimensions, that they're not sort of rival interpretations of what contextual factors might do to the overall interpretation of the meaning of a sentence. And I'm not exactly sure how you think about it, but you certainly think that there are these four phenomena of context dependence that sort of live alongside, and you might focus on some aspect that for some purposes and other aspects on other purposes. But so what I didn't really, so the way I understood, the dispute between, say, Chalmers and Stanaker, I thought they were competing. I thought someone like Stanaker just think there isn't anything like narrow content, right? There isn't an epistemic, interpretation of character, okay? He thinks that there isn't such a thing at all because, you can sort of think of the metasemantic interpretation as this sort of, very radical externalist way of thinking about, the way the external environment determines the meaning of water. So they very much feel like competing accounts of meaning. And I mean, especially if you think in terms of externalism and internalism. And so it's a clear, I can see how you can sort of have this idea that there might be sort of 4 types of dependence of meaning on context, but it's unclear whether it's a happy idea to have them in a single semantics, or what this sort of 4-dimensional single semantics is meant to do, because typically, those who go for the metasemantic, interpretation, will deny that there is anything like an epistemic interpretation. And so I think that's why I wasn't really sure about, how exactly thought these 4 dimensions were going to happily coexist, in one semantics, because typically, the way you interpret, the 2-dimensional frameworks springs from radically different philosophical, interpretations of the notion of meaning, and in particular of the extended notion of character. And I think if you lose sight that this is really, what the stake is between these different interpretations of the 2-dimensional framework, then, maybe there's in some way you can sort of make them all sit together, but it might not be a philosophically happy or completely consistent thing to do. So that was the sort of a key worry I had about the paper, is the extent to which what you really mean by a big semantics encompassing all these semantics, which after all don't seem to be compatible. And I think if you think more in terms of the notion of meaning and character, you sort of start seeing more of the incompatibilities between these. Okay, I've gone on too long, but thank you.
Yeah, okay, so I also now noticed that I made some remarks about meaning now in the talk, about different notions of meanings, which I actually didn't do in the paper, and I didn't make that in the paper. So I think maybe in the talk I already said a bit more about the worries which you addressed now than I actually have in the paper. So I should maybe put that in there. No, but the first thing that I now want to talk about is actually one point, so that you kind of also address, I think, in the end, when you have like semantics in this cursive script. So I think that I'm actually using the term semantics maybe in a confusing or in a wrong way. So if I call the 4-dimensional models, if I call these the semantics of expressions in natural language, or in the same way as you talk about the semantics of expressions in natural language, then I think that wouldn't be the right usage of the term semantics. So it's only a semantics in this very general sense in which every kind of mathematical structure that you use for a modal logic is a semantics. That, however, is then already also a point that you could make for Stolnaker, right? So in some sense, the 2-dimensional matrices that he gives are not really a semantics, but they are just kind of mathematical modal systems to capture the properties of certain expressions, because, right, it's not part of the semantics of the term water that it has a different meanings in Twin Earth than it has here, because this is, well, Stolnaker calls that's exactly the metasemantics. So that's something that I should probably really correct, so that I should really not speak of a semantics if it is something like the metasemantic interpretation, or if it is my 4-dimensional system. And then you had these other worries, or the different notions how you could define what you could take meanings to be, or similarly what characters could be. And there, well, I think what kind of motivates me to, because you are kind of claiming how you have this just different definitions of these terms, and then because they are different, this is incompatible, so you cannot just take them all apart and put them into one big system and pretend that you haven't changed anything. Well, at least one thing that I can say here is that at least if I think about the work by Gillian Russell now, where she actually says, I'm going with Kaplan or I'm going with Stolnaker by calling the meaning that what is the character, so the first two dimensions. And then she still adds a third dimension, which basically does the same role as such that her second and third dimension basically do the same thing as the context does on the epistemic interpretation. So at least what Gillian Russell is doing there is in some sense also a similar thing, right? So she uses you could say, a Kaplanian notion of meaning, which is probably rather an externalist notion, and calls that the character. But she then still goes on to add this additional kind of, well, context dependence, but then that's not context dependence in the same way as indexicals, but something different, which then turns out to capture actually kind of the same things as what Stolnaker or Chalmers do. So, okay, what I'm saying here is now basically, well, I'm almost actually only as bad in this respect as Gillian Russell is already herself, I think. And then the other thing, I mean, the other worry that you got, the other kind of remark you could make is that, well, in some sense it's just a linguistic thing. I mean, it's just a convention. What are you going to call the meaning or the semantics or the characters? And that's in some sense not really an interesting question. And I think that I said that a little bit in the talk. I think that the interesting question that is actually behind the dispute is whether you can have a notion, whether you can distinguish between the third and the fourth dimension. And I think if you would now connect it to narrow content, or whether it's possible to give a meaningful definition of narrow content, that would be just a question whether you can actually single out this third dimension and separate it from the fourth one. And I think people like Stolnaker would say that you can probably not do that in a meaningful way, and people like Chalmers say, no, we can do that in a very meaningful way, and it actually gives us all these advantages that we can talk about a prioricity and, well, use the framework for all kinds of things that he wants to use it for. So I think it's maybe not that interesting to phrase the problem as a problem about what is now semantics, or what is the meaning, or what is the character, but it's more interesting to phrase it as a question about whether we can actually make this distinction between the third and the fourth dimension, and related to that, whether we can actually have a way in which we associate these reference fixing descriptions or whatever they are to twin-earthable expressions. And I think that is really an interesting question, but then in some sense there I'm also saying, yeah, I'm just going with Chalmers to assume that this can be done because I want to make sense of all these systems in one framework, so I have to make at least the assumptions that Chalmers is doing himself. Okay, so and then there was one last thing which you said, and this is, well, why would you, I don't know whether you actually said it, you said something like that, so why would you actually want to distinguish between these different notions of context dependence, because maybe only one of them is the right one for a character or something like that. And also there actually in Amsterdam people have asked a similar question, so they were actually asking, I was giving a talk before in Amsterdam, and in the beginning of the talk, they were already asking during the talk questions. And in the beginning of the talk, yeah, why would you want to do that? This is just not interesting. And then, yeah, okay, this is now maybe a bit too strong, yeah. So in Amsterdam, they would say that pretty much in a less polite way. And then later I had this example with Russell's notion of analyticity, and this was actually, they found that very interesting because they thought that this actually gives a justification to distinguish between the different kinds of context dependence. And maybe I can show you the definition again, because it's actually the case that for this definition you need, let's see whether this comes. So for this definition of analyticity, you actually need to be able to distinguish the context of utterance from the context of introduction, because Russell quantifies over them in an independent way. And also then for these examples with the counterfactuals, with the zebras, there you need to distinguish from the linguistic context from all the other contexts, because that is something what changes counterfactually. And it plays a very different role in these examples from the other contexts, which are just in the quantification for for the analyticity modality. So it was at this point where people thought, now this is actually interesting to have a four-dimensional system because you can give a semantics to analyticity. So this is maybe something that I can say there, that, well, if you're interested in the notion of analyticity and you think that Russell's modal definition has any chance to be a good one, then it might be interesting to actually make all of these distinctions because you need it for that definition. Yeah, I think that's it.
So I was curious what the single thing is that you think is evaluated across all four dimensions. You said at one point that when you were giving the 7 + 5 = 12 example, imagining a situation which some society has a script which looks very much like our mathematical notation but means something totally different, the sky's blue or whatever. And I guess my sort of question is, so it looks very much like our notation, but I guess it isn't. But I take it that you think in some sense it's the same thing that you can evaluate, not only across the 2 or maybe 3 dimensions, but the fourth one too, where something looking the same has got a totally different character, or I guess 3-dimensional character. And so I'm just curious what that is. Is it a sort of shape or a sound, or what kind of a thing is it for you?
Yeah, so I was maybe not saying that so explicitly, but I would, in the paper, I would, for instance, just say that it's a sentence, but this probably doesn't really solve the problem much more.
No.
Yeah, I think that this is actually a question which might be kind of difficult, because you would say, maybe how do you actually find that 2 sentences are the same, or how do? I mean, I know that there's some discussion about this issue, and this is actually, I think, some criticism that people actually give to Stolnaker's account, because it's a problem for his account. And I think it's actually especially something that Chalmers discusses very extensively, so different ways how you could token these sentences, and then depending on how you do it, you could actually get even his system. So if you take a sentence in a language in some sense, then you would already get a much more constrained notion than Stolnaker gets. So I think I cannot say more than just like it's like a sentence, and then what does it mean for 2 sentences to be the same? Actually, is it even necessary that the sentence is at the center of that world at that moment, right? So this is a related question, I think. And I think I cannot give any good answers to that. So I would probably just say I'm going to use whatever Stolnaker would come up with to solve this problem for his framework. Sorry.
So I like very much this framework that you provide. I think it sheds light on the history and the progress of the subject, the topic of context dependence, because if you go back early enough, you'll find the time when people used to think of indexicals as so-called systematically ambiguous expressions. So that was a time when they didn't have the second dimension. So the only way to think of this variation in the reference of indexical was on the model of ambiguous expressions, by actually appealing to the fourth dimension. So they had, as it were, only the first and the fourth dimension, and they had to force indexicals into the mold of the fourth dimension pertaining to ambiguous expressions. But then after Camp and Kaplan have introduced the second dimension, there still were a lot of problems with respect to categories of expressions like proper names, for example. So there are 2 basic theories. I mean, there are many, but there was the indexical theory. Some people thought that names, actually a name like Aristotle shifts its reference depending on context. So they thought actually it's just another kind of indexical. Some people have put forward the view, and others said, no, it's homonymy. So it's like actually ambiguity. And so, and the same, exactly the same debate occurred with natural kind terms. There were people like Putnam saying they're like indexicals, and the people like Bird saying, no, they're like homonyms. It's just the meaning that changes. It was sort of a metasemantic interpretation. So it seems to be methodologically right that in those cases when there are such debates, because some expressions seem to have features of both, say, indexicals and so ambiguous expressions, and are not exactly like them, for example, they seem to be a bit different, then it seems to be methodologically quite sound to try to wonder whether there is not a new category that we need, which means basically a new dimension there. So at least methodologically or provisionally, it's good to try to explore this possibility as you do when you say that we need a context of introduction that doesn't have exactly the same features as, say, the context of utterance. It's different. But I think that if you go that way, then you need presumably a fifth dimension because of the stuff that we heard about earlier today, the context of assessment. It seems that there is something, again, that's not exactly like the other things. So maybe we need more than this, those 4 dimensions. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that I disagree about what you said about the sentence with bachelors, or if bachelors were called zebras, it would be a priori that zebras are unmarried men. I know that many people would say, yes, this is false. But if we talk linguistics, not just stipulation, it's pretty clear that there is one reading of that English sentence in which it is true, and I think that should be captured by the theory as well, but that's sort of a minor point. There is one reading in which you shift the meaning of you use zebras. It's like the riddle. Yeah. If a horse's tail was called a leg, how many legs would a horse have? And it's
But do you now mean the case for a prioricity or the case for analyticity?
No, I'm to the second sentence about a prioricity.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, there I maybe kind of agree actually. Yeah. That there might be 2 readings, but for analyticity, I think there is actually only one that you shifted. Yeah, but I actually agree on I might agree on that point that there might be more readings there, but then that would mean that, well, no, that actually would just mean that there would be 2 ways to embed a priority from the epistemic semantics into the 4-dimensional system. Yeah, that might be. Okay, on the first thing that you said, that we actually need a 5th dimension for tastes or like this kind of expression. So this is something they also said that actually in Amsterdam, and I think maybe you could just do that, but actually here I would. So I think by now that maybe it would be better to actually force the people to say they have to stick to one of those dimensions, or at least if you have. Because I think that the different positions that you have there. So if you want to stick to one of the positions that is already around in the debate, that these are just context-dependent expressions, for instance, then that would say that you would have to put it into one of the context dimensions that are already there. And maybe if it's now not only a 2 but a 4-dimensional system, then you would be forced to make more precise what kind of context dependence this is. Or if you think that they are not context-dependent, but this is kind of like on the circumstances of evaluation, then that would just mean you have to put it into the 1st dimension. So I think it would rather suggest that that there might be an additional position which is different from contextualism or maybe from relativism, if I understand that correctly. So if relativism would just be happy with putting it into the circumstances. So there might be a further position which says we have one additional, entirely new parameter which takes care of this. So, okay, so let me say, I think for contextualism, the 4 dimensions are more than enough, and probably also for like moderate versions of relativism, where you can just say that this is kind of a dependence in the circumstances. But maybe if you have a context of assessment, which is something completely separate, then you would need a 5th dimension. Yeah.
François, did you have a short reply to that? No, it's okay. So John is next. Can I just make sure I have everyone? So John, Manolo, Catherine, Peter, Greg. Yes.
So first of all, if you agree with Francois, then I disagree with both of you about, that sentence. A pun is not a reading. And I am a native speaker of a sort of a version of English, Nebraskan. But anyway, look, I really like the way you distinguish these things. And like Francois said, it's helpful to understand this enormous and confusing literature. But I'm driven back to an idea from the bowels of the last century. John Barweiss and I put forward this idea called a relational theory of meaning. And it was inspired by Kaplan, but the idea was if you had a sentence like, say, Corine is, I am taller than Corine is. I don't know if that's true or not. So you'd have, there's what we call the described situation, that deals with the issue of whether John Perry and Corine, who's taller and who's not. So that's one thing that has to be turn out one way rather than another for it to be true. And then there's what we call the discourse situation. That's what has to be settled to determine the reference of I. Then there's what we call the connective situation. That would have to get you from Corine, used in a particular discourse situation, to a particular individual. Then we also had the resource situation. But each of these seem like quite different sorts of issues. And each of them seems to deal with a very restricted population of objects. In this case, Corine and I and the relation of being taller than, the word I and who was using it and when, the name Corine and how it historically is connected to an individual. What point is there in having a single entity, these enormous, and I would think too enormous to really be represented with sets, possible worlds that provide an answer to every issue about every topic, as opposed to something like we use in situation semantics, much more partial. Partial functions generated on the fly by the issues that are erased in the sentence. So I think in a way, what you've done is very helpful, but I think it ought to cause us, or you, that is, you young folk that are enthralled with the realm Chalmers has built for you, to rethink this whole enterprise. I mean, surely if anyone were handed the project of, say, figuring out the ways a language learner could go wrong in seeing why I am taller than Corine is spoken by this guy is true, he really wouldn't want to have search spaces involving these huge possible worlds. He would want to have very modest search spaces generated on the fly, implemented by partial functions. So thank you for your contribution, but I think it ought to draw the whole project of n-dimensional semantics to an end.
Yeah, I don't really know what I should reply to this. So, I mean, we could have just a general discussion with possible world semantics and situational semantics. I mean, I'm sticking basically here to possible world semantics, right? And you say now that these different uses that possible worlds have, they just show how this notion of a possible world is kind of overloaded and how it's doing too much. And if we would take all of this apart and just look at situations, we could have a much more economic, well set up. Yeah. So in some sense, I think that a correct reply to this would kind of involve the general evaluation of possible world semantics versus situation semantics. But I think there's one small thing that is actually interesting for me, because I found it actually very convenient to have exactly the same kind of object in all of the 4 dimensions. So what you now describe as a disadvantage, because it means that I need to assume these huge possible worlds, was actually very convenient for me, because I didn't have to take 4 different index sets. I could just do with one set W. And I think actually in some sense that might be also what is so convenient about possible world semantics, that you can have these little things, possible worlds, they are just elements in a set, not more. They have no structure whatsoever. And they can function in all these different ways, but they are mathematically extremely simple, so it's very easy to deal with them from a mathematical perspective. So I think, at least if you look from a mathematical perspective, then that's very convenient that these little worlds can do so much. And it's maybe rather from a computational perspective where this becomes very problematic, because these worlds just do much, they are doing too much, and if you would actually have to track all of these little things that they do, then that would become a huge issue.
As far as I can tell, a complete historical accident that modal theory, that models use complete functions. Namely, partial function theory hadn't been developed at the time models were invented. But even for the simplest thing, you can say, well, why do you want to have an assignment to every word in the vocabulary to present an account of what makes it the case that Simon lives in Scotland or something like that? So situations are the same kind of entities for all these purposes. They can be combined. You can build one that does all of the jobs if your sentence requires it. But the partiality, I think, is a separate issue, and I've never really seen any argument for it, for the non-partiality in any of these dimensions, except possibly when you're talking about metaphysical necessity and possibility, in my humble opinion, which will now draw to a close.
Can I just say something? We're already 15 minutes over time, and we have 4 more questions. So I think I'm going to do the irresponsible thing and suggest we take all 4 questions, but make them really short. So Manolo, you're first.
So this should be a question for Stolniker, but I kind of already know his answer, so I'm curious about yours. One thing that, one job that this two-dimensional semantics can do for us is, so it gives us these diagonal propositions, and so we can use those that are necessary to model, to try to model modalities like a prioricity. Or, of course, we cannot do this with a metasemantical interpretation because there are no necessary, no sentence has a necessary diagonal in the metasemantic interpretation. You can always assign any sentence a meaning on which it's false.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's
another thing that another job is that. So, for instance, we can say that when I say a necessary proposition, I am Manolo. What I am communicating or conveying is the diagonal proposition, which is more interesting to convey. But of course, on the metasemantical interpretation, we cannot say that because the diagonal proposition is something to the effect that the actual goal is such that the sentence "I am Manolo" correctly describes it, no matter what it means, which is not something very informative to say. So this is not what anybody can say that I could be conveying when I say I am Manolo. So I'm curious to know whether if it is none of these 2 jobs that, by the way, Stolniker in his classic article of 1978 claimed that we could use two-dimensional contents to perform. If it is none of them, and it's clear that in the metasemantic interpretation you cannot. Which other job do you think?
Yeah. So I think that the first claim that you cannot do a priority as choose on the diagonal in the metasemantic interpretation, that's something that Stolniker actually admits later, and then he says, yeah, I'm also just not really interested in that anyway. Yeah, but for the second thing, I think there he would probably still, and I think he could also say that the diagonal proposition is still interesting if you look at communication. And I think these things that he says in assertion, in these cases where you don't have the same proposition relative to all of the relevant contexts. If the sentence doesn't express the same propositions relative to all relevant contexts, then what you most likely do is just look at the diagonal proposition.
You have to have more fix for that to be an interesting meaning to convey than what you get on the metasemantical interpretation.
Yeah, but I think the crucial point there would be that in an actual conversational situation, you wouldn't think about all the possible words anyway, because you would have the common ground, and there would already be a restricted set of words which contains a lot of information about the meanings of these terms. And in most cases, there would probably be no variance at all, so you could just do with one of these horizontal propositions which is always the same. And if there is some kind of uncertainty about the meaning, then I think that Stolniker could just go with the diagonal and say this is really what it adds to the common ground. So I think actually that I guess that he would say, no, you can still use the diagonal to capture kind of what is communicated by a sentence, as he says it in assertion. And I think the reason why this is confusing is maybe that in assertion he really assumes this just relative to the set of words in the common ground, and he doesn't really care about these words which are already ruled out anyway. So, and I would actually also say go with him there, that I think this actually the metasemantic interpretation would be very, or is very useful for that and could do that job.
Right. I meant to ask about analyticity and why you think you need to fix the actual world there. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, those counterfactuals. You were saying that analyticity is a sentential operator, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a metalinguistic operator. I mean, a priori is a sentential operator, and so it's true for that matter. So I also want to disagree with Francois here on the if a tail was called a leg thing. And it seems to me that all these counterfactuals have exactly the same pattern. I mean, I could use analytic as a sentential operator in the object language. If bachelors were called zebra, then it would be analytically true that all zebras are unmarried men, which I think is clearly false. So I don't think that there's any contrast there between any of these three operators. You can go metalinguistic on all of them if you like to. Then what you're operating with is basically the predicate analytically true in L.
Yeah. So I think
so for the others.
Yeah. Yeah, so then it was actually wrong to call him sentential operator, because necessity would also be a sentential operator. So what I meant there was actually, I think, what Una called metasemantic operator, that they take kind of a sentence in quotation marks and then look what that means, yeah. So this is, I think, the distinction which is relevant here. And I think then you're probably, so you could have a different operator where the sentence la 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 expresses something a priori, which then would have the same semantics as analyticity has here. I completely agree with that. Yeah. However, I mean, usually analyticity is taken to be operating on sentences, and usually analyticity, no, the other way around. Usually a prioricity is taken to operate on something like propositions. They might be very complex. And but analyticity is usually taken to be actually a property of sentences, and this is the reason why I would distinguish the two like this. But in fact, the underlying reason is that one of them is with quotation mark and the other one
yes,
not.
But it's interpreted sentences, not sentences in your sense where they haven't gotten an interpretation yet.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, you could have analytic in a language, right? And then if you don't provide this parameter, then the claim here would be that it comes from the actual world. Yeah, that might actually, not from the actual world, it comes from the world of evaluation. That might maybe be not entirely correct. So we would have to see how philosophers use analytic in a language. Or no, just analytic like this. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks. I also applaud this comprehensive outlook. I have two small methodological words. The first concerns the third dimension and the analyticity. So normally we would think that a context of utterance already fixes the context of introduction, because that's determines the causal history or whatever with respect to which a certain term has been introduced, like water or whatever. And so the only reason for distinguishing them would be that they could be independently shifted. Yeah. And then there doesn't seem to be anything in natural language that would force such an independent shift. So the only thing is the term of art analytic in a certain specific sense. So it's not motivated by natural language semantics, really. It's only motivated by one specifically technically introduced term of semantic theory. And then, of course, one can discuss whether the resulting definition is worth the trouble, so to speak. So there is a question mark about the motivation for that.
Yeah.
Then the fourth dimension, which I almost make my hair stand on end up. I mean, if you would do this model theoretically, you would have in each model, you would have a fourth dimension then, with something like meanings varying between the worlds in the model. And what we would call an interpretation then would be something that would be peculiar to the model, not to a world in the model. So it's a bit, I know that you didn't want to get embroiled in discussion of what meaning means, but if you look at it from a model theoretic point of view, what we call interpretation, if that has to do with meaning, would be something quite distinct from meaning in the sense that it can vary between worlds.
So I think the second point is actually a similar one that we already had before, right? And there it was with semantics, what you actually call the semantics of expressions. And I think basically you're saying a similar thing now, that what you call the actual interpretation.
Interpretation of in a model.
In a model, yeah. And again, I would say no. Yeah, if you take this kind of fourth dimensional, or you take also Stolnaker's metasemantic interpretation, because there you have the same problem in some sense.
I'm against that too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, but I think that the crucial point there is just not to think of the models as giving you the meaning anymore, or giving you kind of the semantics in the sense that you have natural language semantics. But you have to think of the model as capturing like of a wider aspect of what is going on with these expressions. And the motivation for doing so, I think, might be these cases, I mean, where Stolnaker thinks about when you think about communicative situations in which people are uncertain about meanings. And if you want to capture this with some kind of formal framework or some kind of modal logic, then these are the kind of models which you need, even though they don't just give you the semantics of the sentences that occur there, but they capture much more in some sense, all the things that you need to make sense of this uncertainty about meanings. So I think that would be the motivation to have this, and then it's a similar point as before. It's not to give a semantics, but it's in some sense the motivation would have to be something additional, something that you can do more and that you can think about. Yeah, I guess mainly about uncertainty about meanings. And now I forgot the first point that you had.
The lack of motivation from natural language for
there I agree. Yeah, so if you're not interested in kind of giving technical notions of analyticity, but then probably you also have trouble with taking, for a priority, you could say that this has all these other good things that you can do with it than just giving that definition. But yeah, I see that that for natural language that might be not very interesting, yeah.
I also find it useful to distinguish various versions of two-dimensionalism, but I'm suspicious that we shouldn't lose track of the fact that some of these, it's not that they are extensions one of another, and so in order not to overgenerate the dimensions within a single theory, we should maybe keep track of the fact that different people have different projects here, and Kaplan and Stolnaker in particular have different projects, and Stolnaker makes that very clear in the introduction of Context and Content, where he emphasizes that Kaplan uses a metaphysical notion of context, whereas Stolnaker uses a cognitive notion of context. Now, this means that even if you are mistaken about the values about indexicals for Kaplan, if their value is fixed automatically, you cannot say, for instance, today is Thursday, and saying the truth now using that sentence. But according to Stolnaker, since two-dimensional matrices are meant to capture cognitive situations of participants in the conversation, if that's compatible with what they believe, if they are wrong about the meaning of today, they can say the truth, because their beliefs about the word today, if they are shared, will lead them to express the proposition that tomorrow is Thursday. Stolnaker needs only two dimensions to do that, because his project is metasemantic, but only in the sense that it's by virtue of the fact that the facts in the various worlds considered as actual are different semantic facts. So in that sense, it's metasemantic. But actually what he really means, I think he should have said, is more, it's our representation of the semantic fact. So I think it's more useful to distinguish between the objective facts, having a semantics which gives you objective values, and then on the other hand, our perspectives on these values. And if you stick to the idea that there is a semantics, it has objective values, and maybe, you know, you can say there that there are circumstances, context of utterances, and context of introduction, and that these correspond to 3 different moments where a word may receive its extension objectively. But for each of these moments, at least the context of utterance and context of introduction, the speaker may be wrong. Even a competent speaker may be wrong about the value. Then maybe we should distinguish these 2 kinds of projects, subjective and objective. That's my point.
But I think actually that this is a distinction that we might actually make. Do you hear it? Okay. That you might make on a different level than this here, because then you would also need a theory about what is actually expressed by a sentence, or what. Yeah, you would probably need a theory about what is expressed by a sentence, what kind of proposition is expressed by a sentence, if you want to capture these examples about whether a speaker says something accidentally which just turns out to be true without him even knowing that it's true. Or I'm not sure that I got the example now right, but I think the idea was like in some cases the speaker has wrong conceptions about the meaning, so he says something false, but actually he was saying something true, and then Kaplan would say it's true, but Stolnecker would say it's false. So I think the difference that is there would, or I think hopefully it would be enough to capture this difference just on the level how you think about what is said by a sentence. And I think that then Kaplan and Stolnecker would have to give you different definitions, where Kaplan would say you have to look in the actual world what the meanings are there, and Stolnecker would say something more, yeah, you have to look into the common ground or into the beliefs of the agents and see what the meanings are there. So I think that I hope one could account for these examples just as for this difference by just giving different accounts of what is said by a sentence, of the notion what is said by a sentence, or the propositions communicated by a sentence. And I think probably or hopefully the difference would be in that particular definition, and would not really affect kind of the rest of the framework. Yeah, so this is not really a reply, but I think that maybe or hopefully things would turn out like that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank again Johannes and Corine. We're badly over time, so let's take only a 5-minute break, and I really mean it. So at 35 past, we'll start again.